So welcome to our October webcast, Stop Developing Leaders in a Vacuum, Build Leaders Who Deliver on a Strategy. This month's program is on strategic leadership alignment, and we're going to talk about how to create a leadership program that aligns with your strategy.
As typical with our housekeeping rules, the first one is if you've registered for this, you are going to get the recording and any resources within a few days. The second thing is that it's going to be around 30 to 40 minutes long, depending on how many questions we get and how excited we get about certain slides.
Drop your questions in the chat, and we'll address them towards the end. And we'll have a question slide that we'll be dealing with as well. Probably should have started off by saying, I'm John Gabe, this is Cindy Gabe. She's our visionary founder. I'm our integrator partner. She makes things happen. I make things work.
So that's how we got going in this. So why this webcast, John?
So we understand there are lots of different ways to implement leadership development programs, and many of them are off-the-shelf, canned approaches. And what we have found, those that work best have a strategy in mind or are aligned to an organization's strategy. There are hundreds of leadership practices a leader could learn. It makes sense for them to focus on those practices that the organization needs in the future. So the idea before embarking on a comprehensive leadership program is to figure out what you want. And then once you figure out what you want, figure out how well your team does that today, and then let them develop some of the gaps.
So the reason we talk about this is it's one thing to go for those off-the-shelf things, and there's some standard leadership practices that everybody needs to know. And that works really well with high potential performers that you're making leaders, new leaders that need some of the basics. But after a while, your executives and your senior leadership team may need something new because it's not just the standard leadership practices. So imagine if your strategy is to experience some exponential growth. The leadership practices you need to employ are going to be aligned towards that vision. But if you have already experienced exponential growth and you need to take a step back and you need to put some processes and systems in place so you're not just held together by bubblegum and Band-Aids, those are going to require some different leadership practices to lean into. If you are going for exponential growth year after year after year, and you don't take time to put the systems and processes in place, you could just implode on yourself. And we have seen organizations do that. So this is not to say that there's anything wrong with leadership essentials or fundamentals and some of the basics, but at some point you may need to have the leadership team focused on leadership practices specifically aligned to get your strategy accomplished. And that's what this webcast is going to show you what to do.
And the other advantage, and we'll get into this when we get into some of the slides deeper, not only have you recognized what the organization needs to move forward, but the whole leadership team is developing in the same way. So everybody's working on communication, or everybody's working on strategy, whatever it might be, and you have some synergies that come out of the fact that everyone's working on the same set of practices.
This especially works well for those matrixed organizations. So if you have somebody who's reporting to one person for certain activities and reporting to somebody else for another, knowing those two individuals are employing the same leadership practices makes it much easier for the person reporting to those folks to be able to move within those functions seamlessly and to make sure they're getting things accomplished. So it works well in matrixed organizations and when things are changing and shifting and there's more dynamic movement to the strategy to which the leaders need to be aligned. So as you can see in this slide, it all starts with the strategy. So once you are clear about what your strategy is, then aligning those practices is where this program would come into place. It is called the Strategic Leadership Alignment. So once your strategy is aligned, we'll make sure we all review that we're on the same page and the practices are aligned to accomplish those goals, as we said earlier. If you are experiencing rapid growth, then maybe innovation is going to be really important. Hitting production is going to be really important. Delegation, because you can't do it all yourself. What are some of those leadership practices that are really going to be key? And then when you have all of the folks leading in the same direction, you can get a lot more momentum and traction around.
So a little bit about the Metiss Group. We've been around since 1996. We started off in Metro Detroit and expanded down into the Charlotte area in 2008. Two areas of focus. One is accelerating the performance of leaders, and the other area of focus is getting the right people in the organization and selecting the right people to get into the right seats. All of this is a part of our Leadership Academy, and the Strategic Leadership Alignment Program that we're going to be talking about today is one of the pillars within that academy.
So when you think about it, you first have to get the right people in the right seats. And then when it comes to getting extraordinary performance out of them, it really has to come down to the leadership. Because if they are superstars and you're not getting it, it's probably the person in the mirror.
So one of my favorite Stephen Covey quotes, and he's got the 7 habits, and I don't know what number this is. Maybe it's number 2, maybe it's number 1. But he always says, start with the end in mind when you're doing anything, and then you back into what you need to accomplish to get there. Well, we believe that's true in leadership development as well. Figure out what you need to get where you need to go in the next 3 to 5 years. Understand the practices that are needing to be in place. Make sure the organization is okay with that, which we call the Snicker test. And then assess your leaders and then measure against what you're looking to grow and then develop in that regard.
So when you think about it, even when you think about children in elementary school, if you know about 6th grade, at least it was when I was there, that's when you start dealing with some algebra and stuff. Well, that's why in 2nd grade, they're teaching us how to add and subtract. And that's why by 4th grade, they're starting to teach you your times tables. And that's why, because they know that you have to get through those before you can get to the other piece. So when you can start with the end in mind, what do we need to get this person to be able to do? You can back into where we need to start and how we're going to get everybody else on the same page. It also is important, and we'll share this when we get to our case study a little bit later, you may need different leadership practices at different levels of a larger, more complex organization. So things you need at the very executive level might be different than what you need at the first level of leadership, say an accounts payable supervisor versus a CFO. There may be very different leadership practices or a subset that stay the same and some others that change. But once you understand what the strategy is, you can align the leadership practices to that and back into what the individual's personal goals and accomplishments need to be. Then you can make sure everything is really in alignment and prepared for growth.
You know, this does assume that you do have a strategic plan in mind and you know where you're going.
That's why I said this comes in after you have the strategic plan.
Right. So it's most often applicable to most organizations have some idea where they're going in 3 to 5 years. So
yes, for sure.
So the whole idea is to set the leadership objectives before you begin. Oftentimes when leaders or in executive teams decide what they want to work on, it coincidentally tends to be what the CEO
they like the most.
that they like the most or they're already good at.
Right.
We have found that if they focus on where they're going and not necessarily what it's going to take to get there yet, and then back into those leadership skills, they're more objective on what needs to be developed and that the team can all be aligned and can be in agreement on that without their bias coming into play.
So I'll give you a perfect example that happened with one of our clients in upstate New York. First of all, they had a good, strong strategic plan and a great strategic advisor with whom they worked. And they were making progress and realized they kind of hit a plateau. And part of that wasn't that they didn't have a good strategic plan, but they were trying to do the same things over and over again, expecting different results. So we all know that what got you here won't necessarily get you there, and they needed to look at some things differently. So there's really a couple of sessions with the strategic leadership alignment. And in the first 6-hour session that I facilitate, we bring in all the executive team and we review the strategic plan. And then using your own words, we start thinking about, well, what are the leadership practices you think we're going to need in place from everybody in the organization in order to accomplish these goals that you listed out? And they start using a whole bunch of different terms, and some of them might be essentially duplicates. So we synthesize them down to the ones that are being measured by the tool we use. So let's pretend somebody says, oh, we need new solutions to old problems. Oh, yeah. We need to get into a new market. Oh, yeah. And so eventually we narrow those down to, okay, so that means we need innovation. Okay, that's great. So we've narrowed this down, and when we came out of it, you'll select 5 to 10 out of 22 that the organization is going to focus on. More than that, there's no way you're going to accomplish them all. And so in this one particular group, they chose one that was called excitement. Now, I don't really like that particular term. I wish it said passion, like you're bringing energy and passion around leadership. You're giving people feedback. They're getting some of the stuff that they need, but you're demonstrating some enthusiasm towards the goals and towards the work. So they all thought, yes, for sure, we're going to need that if we're going to rally the troops and get everybody to where we needed to go. Well, eventually the leadership team got their results back and they realized the whole leadership team was really low in excitement except for one person. Well, the funny thing was they looked at me and they said, maybe we should just take that off the list. Maybe we don't want that. I said, no, you can't pick it based on what you're already good at. If you know the organization needs it and you're weak at that, imagine the difference you can make when you're all working on doing that a lot better than you are now. So that created some alignment. There was also some vulnerability. They admitted they were all pretty poor at it and that they could help each other, kind of like a support group for leadership.
Yeah, I think the key here is for whether you use our tool or not doesn't really matter. What's important is the leadership team have some sort of unbiased way of determining what their practices are needed to be moving forward. It's typically easier if you've got a coach or somebody to help guide you through that. But the whole purpose of this practice is to objectively pick, without bias, those leadership practices that are needed to achieve your 3 to 5 year strategic goals.
Yeah, and even if it's not us, to John's point, having an external person really keeps those biases to a minimum, because it would be really hard if you really knew the culture and you knew, oh, there's no way we're going to be innovative, and you kind of guide everybody away from innovation. That might be the very thing you need, but because it feels foreign to the organization, an internal facilitator may inadvertently avoid that.
So over the years, we have administered hundreds, if not thousands, of these organizations and helped them identify what their organization needs to move forward. And there are 20, in this particular instrument we use, there are 22 practices that are evaluated that an organization should choose 5 to 8 of to help them 5 to 10 to help them focus on what they need to achieve their objectives. We wanted to give you an idea what some of the more common ones are. This is by no means exhaust or
it's not inclusive or exclusive of any others.
But these are 5 common categories that our clients in the past have identified that were needed for them to achieve their strategic directive. There's a strategic component that most organizations have. Growing organizations need to make sure they develop those delegation skills. Communication, particularly now that there's a hybrid work environment, is always important. And feedback and production are a couple of other ones that our clients have found that are needed in their focused area.
In fact, we often call the middle 3 the trifecta of leadership. So communication is setting your expectations up front, being clear and concise about what we need. Delegation is then delegating, giving people important tasks and the autonomy to accomplish them. And feedback is telling them whether or not, in doing those delegated tasks, they met the expectations you communicated up front. So the 3 of them really are very powerful together. When it's like a 3-legged stool. If any one of those 3 is missing, we have a problem. If somebody delegates by doing the dump and run here, and takes off without being clear about expectations, that's going to be a problem. If you over communicate and then micromanage the heck out of people without giving them the autonomy to do stuff, that's going to be a problem. You're not really saving time or leveraging all your talent. And if you communicate up front and delegate well, but whether or not they met your expectations is a secret. You don't give them any feedback. They don't know what to do with it, or if they made you happy, or if they were on the right track or not. So those 3 tend to be very powerful, and we see those coming up frequently within our clients, for sure. So like any other program, if it's not sticky, it isn't really going to work. And this is the process that we recommend our clients go through when they're doing any kind of leadership development, and spend some time up front figuring out what they want, and we call this the strategic direction assessment, and this is where they determine the leadership skills that are going to be necessary.
And then you have some self-evaluation and some assessment that ends up being debriefed in an executive workshop, which is common in any kind of process. But the real power is putting it into play, practicing it, getting feedback, learning more, putting it in play again, getting feedback, learning more. It's that 70-20-10 approach to learning that makes it sticky in any kind of leadership program.
Yeah, and what we found is it's one thing when you're coming together and in these workshops, whether it's setting the strategic direction or when you're getting the feedback on your 360 to start with, before you see your own personal results, before we reflect on what's specific to the organization, we look at some case studies. It's a lot easier to be critical about somebody you don't know and their profile. And so in one of the very fun case studies, we look at what an organization's culture is like, and there's 3 candidates to come in as a CEO, and you're looking at these 360s and which one would fit it best. And so you can tell based on where the organization's going, none of these 3 candidates would be ideal and none of them will be horrible, but which one is going to fit it best? And so the leadership team that is part of this process is put into an exercise where they're trying to work with these processes and understand and work with all the leadership practices and understand how they overlap each other. So as an example, somebody who's really high in production and really high in feedback, but is really low in empathy, is only giving one kind of feedback. And so we may need to balance that out with a little bit higher empathy. And so they get to play around with those combinations before they get their own results. And so that workshop is important, but then being able to have that one-on-one with their coach where they're talking specifically about their results, things they want to work on, putting a development plan in place and the progress against it is pretty powerful.
Well, maybe we should have emphasized this a little bit more earlier, but we recommend leaders when they're having their leadership skills evaluated in an assessment, have it done in a 360 fashion. So not only do they measure what they themselves think of their leadership skills, they're also getting feedback from their boss, from their peers, and from their direct reports. One of the things that we encourage these leaders to do after they get their results is to meet with their observers and share with them some of the findings and get their observers' feedback on why they might have gotten scored in a certain way in a less threatening environment as they're starting to create their development plan and grow.
And I think that's where we can talk about the uniqueness of this 360. So we happen to use a 360 called the Leadership Effectiveness Analysis by MRG, our Management Research Group. One of the things we love about MRG's tools is that it is not Likert-based. And Likert-based means on a scale of 1 to 10 or from always to never, how cooperative is John? Well, there's all kinds of rater biases that come into play with that, right? And so you really can't compare it. Oh, plus John may never give out a 5, I may never give out a 1. Now what do we do? How do you average these scores? It's kind of crazy. So if you can look at the way MRG has some of these sample questions in their questionnaire, they're measuring 22 leadership practices against each other 9 times across 66 questions. So here it is, I see this person as lively and dynamic, valuing my opinions, or a helpful associate. Which is most like them at a 4 or a 5, which is next like them at a 3 or a 2. And so when you have somebody going through this, it's a forced comparison. You can get much stronger data, and it is statistically available to be normalized. So you can look at things within an industry, within North America, within other countries, and so you can really look at that differently, and you can tell it really can't be gamed.
So just for people who didn't know, a Likert questionnaire is a questionnaire that says on a scale of 1 to X, generally is 1 to 5, rate this person. And that tends to be way too subjective. It tends to be susceptible to rater bias. So coming up with a 360 questionnaire that is not necessarily a Likert approach tends to give you a much more accurate view of the participant.
It also allows you, if you wanted to see where everybody was at now, and 360s can only be used for development. They're not to be used for any employment decisions. You can't promote somebody or demote somebody or fire somebody because of 360 results. But it is used for development. So if after they understand where they're at, how they're perceived versus how they're intended to behave, and they put a development plan in place, about 18 months later, you can do the 360s again and see if the scores that they were working on actually changed. And you can do that because of the construct of the tool being so pure.
And whatever instrument you use and whomever you're working with, I strongly encourage you to ask to see the questionnaire.
Yeah.
And make your evaluation of the tool looking at that questionnaire being a part of it. It has such a big impact on the validity of the results. The report at the end is nice, but it's the questionnaire behind any kind of assessment that is going to determine its effectiveness.
Yeah, we've seen too many of the Likert-based tools weaponized. We've seen them weaponized by an observer who really wants to get their digs into their boss. We've seen some bosses get the results and go, I know why so-and-so's, that had to be so-and-so, and this is why they said that, because this just happened, and they discredit some of the feedback they're getting that could have been quite valuable. In this case, even when the individual themselves is taking the score, as you'll see soon, you'll see a self-score, the peers, the direct reports, and the boss, as John was saying, they don't even know why their own scores came out the way they did. So they understand that nobody's trying to game it. It's a gift to be able to understand the difference between how you're intending to behave and how you're being perceived.
So this is an example of what happens when you get results back. This is just a top part of a report that lists some of the skills that have been evaluated in this particular sample. You can see conservative, innovative, technical, self, and strategic are one set of skills. What's nice, and then persuasive, outgoing, excitement, and restraint there is another part of the sample. But this is a way where you can show the scores by participant group for each one of the skill sets and get a feel for, in this particular case, the purple dot is the direct report scored conservative at 15 for this particular leader, whereas they scored themselves at 65. But it gives you a really good feel for the way the different people that are interacting with the leader are evaluating them.
Yeah, and it's really fascinating. First, in the strategic direction session, where the executive team is picking 5 to 10 that are most critical, those that are most critical would typically be, we're going to target the high mid range. So let's say we wanted innovative to be one of them, high mid makes sense. If you're a 96 on innovative, you're going to look like a water bug, just constantly chasing the next bright shiny thing and a little too flaky. As opposed to conservative. And you're not going to look to score high on everything because some of these are opposites, like conservative or innovative. And so when we're looking at these, it's really important, to John's point, of also looking at your self-score versus everybody else's. So in this particular case on conservative, the individual scored themselves a 65, but their direct reports were a 15. Well, how is that happening, right? There's a blind spot there that needs to be investigated. We also had one organization with whom we were working. We worked with 117 of their leaders. So in different, it took us about a year to get through all of the leaders because we probably did 10 or 12 at a time. But the reason they embarked on it is the C-suite was convinced the next layer down, the vice presidents, did not have a strategic bone in their body. And so they were hoping, as they did the other layers, they were going to find somebody around that had some strategy that they could groom and develop further. What was interesting is when we got the results back for those vice presidents, their peers and their direct reports rated them very strong on strategic, but not their bosses. And when we dug into it, we found out that the bosses, the C-suite, didn't want to hear about problems until the proverbial hit the fan. And then it was very tactical. This just happened. We got to do this. We got to do this. We got to do this. And there was no strategic conversation. So we eventually encouraged them to have some one-on-one conversations once a week between the C-suite and the vice presidents and make sure a third of the conversation was around strategy. So 18 months later, when they revisited it, the strategic scores of all the vice presidents went up higher. It wasn't that they weren't good at it. It was just that particular observer group couldn't see it. And so sometimes part of the development plan is tweaking your talking points or how you're demonstrating some of this to those particular people.
So one of the things that's important after you get your results back is to figure out what you're going to do with them. And we encourage the leaders to put together some sort of development plan to help them get from where they are currently evaluated at to a level that the organization is looking for in that skill set to get them to the strategic objective that they started with. This is just an example of a development plan that we recommend. One of the two very important things about any development plan. There's a measurable goal, something that you can actually evaluate as to whether or not it was accomplished, and time-based. So we call it an MT goal. That's part of every development plan. And however you structure it, you should make sure that you've got those pieces on your plan.
So giving you an example of that, the development need may be back to innovative, or let's say is delegation. So let's say my goal is to get better at delegation. That sounds great. How are we going to know? Well, if my measurable time-based goal is that I want to delegate 3 programs that are delivered on time and on budget within the next 6 months, that's both measurable and time-based. And now on the second page of this, there are action steps. So you can list out measurable time-based action steps. First, I have to decide what projects am I delegating? And that needs to be done by a certain date. To whom am I delegating those projects? That has to be determined by a separate date. I need to teach them the delegation model that I'm going to be using by a separate date. And so there can be some action steps right up front, and those can be built on over time. So when the leader of the individual who's working on their development plan says, hey, how are you coming on your development plan? You should be able to see progress on the very action steps that you know are going to lead to accomplishment. And we'll usually narrow it down to 3 development plans. Yes, everyone's going to narrow it down to 3 development plans that they really want to work on moving forward. So
we wanted to share a story about one of our clients who has a pretty aggressive 3-year sales growth. And they knew that before they could achieve those objectives, there were certain leadership traits that needed to be in place to get there. So what they did is they decided as an organization what the skill sets that they needed to focus on. They evaluated their leadership team, and they had one set of skills that they were working on to get to the 3-year objective. And then they went to different levels within the organizations and tweaked those skills a little bit to reflect what those leaders at that level needed to do to achieve those goals.
So as some more specifics, they happen to be a property management company, and they manage apartment communities all over the country. So at the executive level, they needed a lot of strategic, they needed a lot of innovative, they needed some delegation and some of the other ones. When it came to the second tier, the regionals, those regionals needed a little less strategic, a little less innovative, higher in production, some things like that. When they got to the community managers, they didn't want any strategic and they didn't want any innovative. They wanted high structuring. They wanted a lot of production. They wanted people just following the rules. This and implementing those things so that there was consistency across all the communities. The other thing that this did for them was that it made succession planning much easier. Once the community managers mastered those skills at that level and they wanted to start preparing themselves to get to the regional or the area level, stepping up to regional, they could look ahead to what leadership practices were going to be needed at the next level and start studying those, start practicing those on smaller project basis so that by the time they were promoted, they were ready to rock and roll. They weren't like behind the 8 ball and having to learn those things. And the same thing going from regional up to vice president or C-suite. So it did a lot to make sure that everybody was focused on the right leadership practices for their roles, but also as they were doing some succession planning.
And it did phenomenal success. Go ahead and Google them. You'll see that they now have properties all over the country, very, very heavy within certain markets, all because they stepped back, figured out what they wanted to do, how they're going to get there, and measured it across different leadership levels. Mm-hmm. So drop your questions again into the chat. We'll answer them shortly here. Go ahead and get a copy of this leadership report. It is a phenomenal guide to give you an idea what a comprehensive leadership evaluation looks like. This is an example of a 360 report. You'll see how the self-feedback comes into the report, the boss, the direct report, and the peers all come together to give the leader insights into their skill sets that they wouldn't have had before.
The other thing is that we'd be happy to talk about anytime you guys want is some of the combinations of these. You know, you can't just go through and check off some of the leadership practices you think would be great because you can't necessarily anticipate what some of the combinations would be, but they become incredibly interesting. One of the things we've also realized over time, so MRG has been around since 1986. And so they have a wealth of data and they have been tracking leadership practices over some time. And some of the newest feedback says that those leaders who employ some degree of empathy, some degree of emotional intelligence, have far greater productivity and higher performance than those who try to be less empathetic and leave emotions out of this and just are a little distant to their direct reports. And it is scientifically proven now, which is bringing to light the need for some things getting into emotional intelligence and developing those things further that, 30, 40 years ago were really non-existent.
So go ahead and get that download. It's phenomenal. You'll enjoy it. Also, don't forget to sign up for the upcoming webcast.
Speaking of emotional intelligence.
It's coming up next month on November 18th. We're going to be talking about the value of a 360 on emotional intelligence. Just like in leadership, getting a view from others around you on what your skill set is way more valuable than just your self-view. So we got that coming up in November. We're gonna do our annual December
Review?
2025 review in this case, kicked off by January, talking about what sort of leadership trends we can expect next year. And then we got succession planning and accountability coming up in the spring.
Yep, and we alluded to a little bit here about the difference between how you intend to behave and how you're being perceived, and those are rarely aligned well, but we'll get into that a little bit more when we talk about the Emotional Intelligence 360 on November 18th.